Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to rate the story at the end. Apron, not cufflinks. The thought felt ridiculous and strangely peaceful as Andrew Hoffman slid a dull, flower-streaked bib over his suit shirt and tied it with hands that had rarely touched a stove. He had watched the Magnolia Bistro's receipts shrink for months from the safety of a glass tower downtown, counting margins and blame lines on spreadsheets. Numbers told him something was wrong. The look on the neighborhood regulars' faces the last time he'd eaten in the corner booth told him something worse. He needed to see what numbers could not catch, the way the staff moved under pressure, the way a manager's tongue could cut longer than any shortage report. The Magnolia wore its name like a memory. Narrow windows fogged by breath and steam framed battered wooden tables. A single magnolia blossom embroidered on the faded napkins leaned toward the door as if it, too, hoped better days would come. The steam from espresso and simmering stock blurred faces in the kitchen. The menu had once been a love letter to the neighborhood, short, proud, faithful to local growers. Lately, it read like a list of concessions, cheaper suppliers, fewer seasonal plates, the same 2 cocktails with less ice. Harper Wells moved through the bistro as though it were a living thing she kept in steady rhythm. She wiped a table with deliberate reverence, set down a warm mug with the exact right tilt, and spoke to the regulars with the kind of sarcasm that softened into real warmth when she laughed. Her hair was braided, once practical. Her hands bore the small calluses that meant she cooked even when she waited. When she wasn't busy, she stood at the pass and watched the line of orders like a musician reading sheet music. The pans sang for her in notes she could turn into dinner. Rick Thompson watched people too, but with the narrowed, hungry calculation of someone who had learned to rule by fear. He kept pens behind one ear and a sternness in his jaw. He managed problems the same way he did inventory, trimmed them down, pushed them out. He loved public humiliation the way some men loved applause. It showed him where his authority lay. Andrew had intended to go in only for a day, to sit as a customer and observe. That plan collapsed within an hour. The kitchen was short-staffed. A line of regulars had the impatient sheen of people who had been promised something they were no longer sure would arrive. When a dishwasher called in sick, Rick barked a demand no one liked to meet. Anyone who can handle plates, do it now. We can't lose another seat. Harper's hand shot up out of reflex, bolder than the apology she gave to the room. I can do dish tonight. I'll pick up a closing shift. Something in Andrew's chest, that steady, professional distance, loosened. He stepped forward before he could measure the impropriety of it. "I'll help," he said. It was an absurd sentence from an absurd man, one who had flown in for the weekend and had no right to call himself anything more than a customer. David Martinez, his chief of operations, had coached him in undercover protocols with too many corporate case studies and too little smell of garlic. But up close, with plates stacked like pale moons in his arms and hot steam freckling his face, the bluff felt purer. He wanted to know what the staff saw every night, not what numbers told him in the daytime. He introduced himself simply, Andrew, just Andrew, and tied the apron as if the knot could teach him humility. The apron brushed against his knees and smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and lemon oil. It became, for the first time in months, a literal border between him and the world he had built above the city. "Don't drop it," Harper said without looking at him, handing over a crate of washed cups. The words were surface flint, small, practical, no pretense. There was a quickness to her voice that made him want to stay in the kitchen and earn a right to hear the softer things. The staff accepted him with the wary grace reserved for people whose worlds had folded inward with too many disappointments. Linda, who kept the pastry station like a temple, offered a nod. Elena, a cook with a gentle laugh and a small, patient way of tying her hair, slipped him a towel and a look that said, "Be careful." The kitchen hummed like a small heart, steady, loud, and vulnerable. Orders clattered, oil popped. The night unfolded in neat, dangerous choreography. Rick barked at a server for taking too long with an upsell. "You're here to work, Linda, not gossip," he said, and the sentence clipped like a knife. The morning patrons were still polite. The regulars smiled through a collective resignation. But the staff's faces carried the faint strain of someone who has learned not to call out a wrong they fear will only return harder. Andrew watched, cataloging rhythm and tempo, the ways the servers flinched when Rick approached, the way Harper met his glare with a soft, defiant humor. She joked with a nervousness like a shield and wiped a table so thoroughly the wood seemed to sigh under the movement. Once, when a regular asked for a substitution, she set the plate down with a small flourish and said, "Today's for you, Mr. Byrne. Consider it an early rebellion." The regular laughed and folded the day into something brighter. The staff clung to those small victories like sailors clinging to a mast. The first week of service for Andrew blurred into a practice in observation. He learned the name for every plate, the measure of time that made a crust perfectly blister, and the cadence of a closing shift. He learned the secret corners where supplies were hidden and the ledger that Rick kept in a battered drawer where tip pools were thin and discrepancies started to appear. He listened more than he spoke, letting the kitchen speak to him through scratches and sighs. David's instructions, measure, document, avoid interference, sat at the back of his mind like a lawyer ready to object. But when he saw Harper 2 nights in a row come in early, slipping an envelope under the register with hands that trembled only a little, he could not keep the hand of a billionaire out of that small private moment. It took 3 nights for him to hear the story properly. Over a late cigarette break behind the dumpster, Harper admitted the outline and pried away the second layer only when she trusted his silence. "My brother," he said, in a voice that dropped the banter like scales from her eyes. "Insurance is a kindness someone else has to give when you've been good. We're not always good enough." She shoved a hand into her pocket and drew out a photograph. A photo of a young man compressed into hospital bedding, lips moving around something tired and important. Money, it turned out, had nothing to do with Harley and everything to do with dignity. She refused charity that came with condescension. She refused loans that smelled of pity. If she could win the regional cooking contest, the prize money and the publicity might fund a year of treatment and also give her a platform to start something of her own, a food truck that would travel to neighborhoods where fresh, thoughtful food didn't cost a mortgage. The contest was not just money, it was identity, a way out, a way forward. Andrew felt the old calculus begin to unravel. A businessman framed in ledgers could write checks. A person framed in aprons could not. The right answer, satisfy someone's debt immediately, sounded like a charity ad in his head, cheap and insufficient. He wanted to do better, to change the system, but change was slow and bills came faster. Rick noticed the new levity between Andrew and Harper and tightened his behavior like a wire. It was small at first, a sharp comment, a delay of a plate, the reassignment of a table to a woman who could not manage the crowd. The public humiliation came in a way the staff had learned to dread. Rick called Harper to the front during a Saturday dinner rush and read her a reprimand about a missing order in a voice that suggested the missing order was a moral failing. He made the reprimand loud enough to be spectacle, loud enough that patrons watched. He did not accuse her of theft, he accused her of incompetence, and in this kitchen, incompetence was a crime. She said nothing at first, her hands stilled on the pad she held, fingers lingering on the corner, as if the pad could anchor her. Then she asked quietly, "Which order was it?" "It?" The question was concise and professional. Rick answered with sarcasm so sharp it clipped applause out of the room. Someone in the back, Elena perhaps, swallowed a sound. Later, in the dim staff room between shifts, Harper's shoulders curled with a small storm of shame that made Andrew resent what his company had become. He had seen films where rich men had arcs. He had not seen how a business could make the people who ran its heartbeat feel expendable. Rick's power felt like petty cruelty threaded through policy. He tried to collect himself. He filed notes. Who had seen what, timestamps for delivery, margin discrepancies. And David set up a legal-friendly trail. Copies of shift sheets, inventory logs, a pattern of complaints recorded with time. They were evidence, not revenge. But Andrew's sympathy hardened into action in a way that surprised him. He paid Harper's utility bill anonymously, left a small envelope at the register with no name and a note that said, in his neat handwriting, "Keep cooking." The envelope was an impulse. He justified it in private as a bridge. David found him the next morning, eyes tired but sharp. "You did not sign off on that through me," David said. He had the look of a man who had seen too many smart people make poor decisions. "We can get more permanent solutions. Sponsorship, documented support, a community fund. You can't be seen giving money to an employee. It's a breach." Andrew met the accusation with a defensiveness he had not expected. "She needed it," he said. "I needed to—" He stopped. The sentence collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. He had needed to be part of the world he wanted to fix. David did the sensible thing. He recommended Andrew slow down, collect evidence, let HR audit the books, and when necessary, confront Rick with proof. He also warned of the non-linear ways gratitude turned to expectation and of the danger of being the anonymous saint who would become a secretive manipulator if he didn't check his motives. Andrew checked himself, at least outwardly. He continued to stack plates, to get flour in his hair and coffee on his shirt. He learned the cadence of Harper's laughter and the precise way she seasoned a pan with a fingertip flick. She taught him once how to fold a perfect omelet, her wrist flicking with an ease that made him watch his own hands and feel the insistent schooling of humility. The contest loomed up like a lighthouse 3 blocks down the calendar. It was the kind of high-stakes, high-sheen public event that could lift somebody out of a small life or grind them down further under the weight of fame. Thomas Green, a food critic with a droll smile and a social feed that could make or break a small restaurant, had visited once and scribbled something in a small leather notebook. His note, when he published it, would call attention to Harvey. The ripple would ripple beyond the bistro and into neighborhoods that mattered. Rick, for reasons that smelled of threatened ego, began to sabotage in the small ways bullies understand best. He reassigned prep tasks so that Harper received the worst cuts of meat. He double-booked her for closing and forced a server shortage on the busiest night. He spread a rumor that Harper had cut corners in a health inspection. Rumors had weight in the Magnolia. A rumor could push a patron to a door and leave a seat empty. Harper fought like water, precise, resilient, bending but not breaking. Still, each small humiliation left a bruise. Andrew watched Rick's pattern and felt the legal and moral axis of his life tilt under the weight of evidence. He had collected numbers. He now watched someone weaponize small, persistent cruelty. He compassed his options. Take Rick to an HR hearing with a stack of documented unfair assignments and inventory discrepancies, or expose Rick publicly and risk turning the kitchen into a staged battleground. He chose the former, documented evidence, witness statements from Linda and Elena, timestamps stamped with David's crisp professionalism. They built a case that was procedural, defensible, and aimed at reform rather than spectacle. And yet, when Harper confided that the contest needed a small entry fee, a travel stipend, and a guarantee that a dish would be highlighted in its program, things that could not be solved by policy, Andrew felt the old impulse return. He made a choice that night that tasted like both compassion and arrogance. He paid the contest entry anonymously, wired the stipend to an account under a friend's name, and nudged a small favor to a judge through a connection David had warned him not to use. It worked. Harper's application was accepted, and she received a modest nod on the program. She practiced with a ferocity that made pans tremble. Her signature dish, a roasted root tangle with browned butter and pickled citrus, took shape like a promise. When she found out that someone had helped, she assumed the Magnolia community, or perhaps a local benefactor. She did not know the identity of the hand behind the envelope. Andrew did not tell her. At the time, he told himself that anonymity was gentler, that the work would speak for itself. He told himself many arguments for poor judgment. He kept the apron on and walked through the kitchen like a man trying to learn new bones.
The contest was a weekend away, and the week before crackled with the kind of nervous electricity that sharpened every exchange. Harper practiced in the quiet hours, humming to herself as if the food needed a lullaby. The staff rallied in small, earnest ways. Linda offered off-hours pastry runs to keep Harper's energy up. Elena worked as her silent, steady Suze. Andrew found himself staying late not to oversee, but to watch, catching the smallest instance where Harper would pause and breathe, where the system of her life was held together by discipline and love.
On the eve of her departure, Harper stood in the doorway of the staff room with a box of mise en place wrapped like a little ritual offering. She handed Andrew a wrapped set of spice jars, cumin, smoked paprika, sumac, because she had noticed his choke of nerves at the pass and the way he smelled faintly of the city rather than of the kitchen. For seasoning, she said, and her tone had the same irony and warmth he had come to love. So you stop tasting like diluted confidence. He laughed, a small sound that felt reckless, and accepted the gift with both hands. He wanted to tell her then, with the rawness of someone who had learned the wrong lesson too quickly, that he had helped with the entry fee. He wanted to confess and give her the choice to accept or refuse. But he did not. The confession would wait for another scene, another courage. The Magnolia watched her go, and the kitchen hummed with an expectant silence. The contest, for Harper, was not simply about a prize. It was an argument to the world that her talent belonged in spaces larger than cramped staff rooms and clipped tips. It was a declaration she said she wanted to make for her brother and for herself, a claim of dignity. Andrew watched the food truck idea seed into her eyes. He felt something by then that was not merely admiration. It was the ache of someone who saw in another's ambition an answer to a loneliness he hadn't known how to name. He told himself to be patient, that his opportunities to do right would come in the form of policy and reparations, that he would be the man who remade the kitchen from the ledger out, that he would not be the man who simply bought someone's victory. Reason sat beside a more dangerous thing, hope. On the morning the contest started, the city felt impatient, as if it too wanted news that would be kinder than the month's worth of shrink reports and boardroom memos. Harper boarded a bus with a duffel, a cooler, and a precise set of instructions about time and temperature. Andrew drove to the bistro early and watched the door close behind her, the bell chiming as if it had always been a small benediction. He felt exposed. He knew that sooner or later a camera might find the billionaire in an apron incongruous, and the narrative would quicken in a way he hadn't intended. That morning, a local food photographer stopped by to take a few shots for an online column, a woman who liked to highlight hometown underdogs. She moved through the dining room with a practiced ease, asking questions and clicking a shutter that made the world tilt. David had warned Andrew, media were never neutral. A photograph could be a kindness or a trap. Andrew thought of the anonymous envelope, the unpaid whisper of a favor, and the document trail that would later look like a careful man trying to do justice. Across town, the contest hall filled with the clatter of metal and the murmur of judges who wrote in shorthand. Harper's dish readied like an argument on a plate. Smells of butter, the brightness of citrus, a grounding umami that reminded the judges of home and of coaxed grief. Thomas Green, who sometimes took a perverse joy in dismantling hype, watched with an interested smile that was not always kind but often fair. When the crowd cheered for a dish that felt whole and true, it was not only a victory for technique, it was a verdict for the person who had made it. When the announcement came, first runner-up, then a hush that made the room lean in, Harper held the trophy like someone accepting permission to exist in a new size. The prize money was enough to cover a year of treatment and seed her truck. Her face shone in a way the Magnolia had not seen since a summer of better customers. The photograph that a freelance journalist took that night, though, would do something Andrew had not planned. It was crisp and honest. Harper, trophy in hand, was laughing into the light. Behind her, an indistinct figure in the crowd, tall, apron dark at the waist, leaned as if to speak. The caption under the photo would later read a small, innocent line, "A magnolia in bloom, and the man who keeps the orchard."
The journalist's post did not know the man's name at first. It only registered the image, a man in an apron, present at a contest that seemed to belong firmly to someone else. But the internet, a thing of small pieces and savage curiosity, worked faster than most people could contain. A local blogger recognized the cuff of a watch someone had once seen on a rare public photo at Andrew's penthouse. A friend of a friend tagged a picture. Within hours, a familiar surname began to scaffold itself under the image. It would be easy, too easy, for a narrative to turn the photograph into a scandal. The billionaire at the contest, the secret helper, the conflict of interest. That night, a small line of texts began threading toward a reveal that would change everything. Andrew woke to the world already moved around him. His phone, always kept face down on the kitchen island, lit up like a prayer lamp. Notifications fell in a single, inexorable rain. A friend's alarmed emoji, a brief message from his sister asking if he was all right, a headline from a site he had not expected to read, then another, then the same photograph repeated with new captions and new insinuations. He opened the article that had threaded his name to the image. The blogger had done the work of connection with a cheerfully ruthless efficiency. Cuff glimpsed, rooftop shot identified, a photograph from last year's gala surfaced, and in under an hour the blogger had assembled a narrative that smelled of scandal. Billionaire.
Patron at local contest? The headline asked, the question mark making the accusation seem tentative and therefore more salacious. David was on his way by the time Andrew finished skimming. He arrived in a wool coat, newspaper folded under his arm like a talisman. He did not bother with small talk. The questions he asked were the ones that moved down a ledger. Who knew? Who could prove influence? Where might legal risk appear? Andrew answered in blunt, measured sentences, because there was nowhere for theatrics. He had been at the contest. He had not intervened. He had not met with the judges. He had not put money up for a competitor. He had watched, he said, and he had watched because he liked to be where things were being made. He told David about the photograph, about the caption that had already been embroidered by strangers into a storyline of favoritism, about Harper laughing and the faint silhouette of a man as if in conversation. David listened, then sat back in the leather chair and folded his hands. This will not die down by itself, he said. People will love to believe the story that fits a pattern. Your name makes the pattern. There will be calls from the board. There will be questions from the bistro's partners. There will be lawyers on both sides smelling the fruit. You have to decide the posture to take before the posture is chosen for you. Andrew thought of Harper laughing into the light. He thought of the small, deliberate economy of her gestures when she cooked, how she never asked for permission to be seen. She only arranged the world until it admitted her. He thought of the promise he had made to himself to be patient, to let policy and structural change be his avenue for doing right. He had believed that anonymity would be his protection, for Harper and for himself. But anonymity had always been an illusion. The photograph had pulled his hands into the open like a tide. Before David could sketch a plan, his phone announced another call. It was Harper. She sounded brittle at first, not the bright voice he had heard the night of the contest, but something taut with fatigue and a new kind of dread. "Andy," she said. "Andrew," she corrected herself for form's sake. "Have you seen?" He told her what he'd seen, because there was no sense in mirror-polishing feints. She made a small, humorless sound at the other end of the line. "They're saying I didn't earn it," she said. "They're saying, patron, pay to play, that someone bought my trophy for me." She had worked with a dignity so rough it sometimes bordered on stubbornness. Now that dignity felt like a thing under threat of being rebranded as debt. "You won by the work you did," Andrew said. He tried to shape the truth into something other than a defense. "Thomas stood up for you in front of the judges." Flavors were what they were. "You earned this." "But look at it," she said. "The whole world reads pictures like proofs. If I'm a charity case, if my story becomes a narrative about what someone gave me, what is the point?" Andrew thought of the duffel she had taken on the bus,
of the precise instructions about time and temperature she had left on the counter. She had wanted her victory to be an argument made on the merits of her hands. The last thing he wanted was for that argument to be reduced to an illustration of his capacity to buy headlines. "We'll be careful," he said. The lie felt thinner than he intended. "I won't let them turn you into something you're not." Harper was silent for a long time. The night had left her edged and raw. "People will talk," she said finally. "And I don't trust talk. I don't want to be anyone's headline. I don't want to be a charity story." "What do you want?" he asked. She breathed, and in that breath he heard the smallest, defiant fire that had always been there. "I want my truck. I want to be able to cook for myself. I don't want to be rescued." He wanted to tell her then that rescue and dignity were not mutually exclusive, that he had never been interested in reducing her to an object of pity. He wanted to explain how he had come to the bistro that morning not as a patron, but as someone who had been learning, someone who had been present in the small ways that meant, to him, acknowledgement. He wanted to tell her that he would not let his resources become the headline if it meant stealing her authorship. But words like that sounded like philosophy in the face of a smear. "Let's be ahead of it," David said when he heard the line go quiet. His voice had a strategic calm to it now. "If you make a statement, say you attended the contest as a private citizen, that you did not communicate with the judges, and that Harper's victory stands on its merits. Offer support in private if you must, but do not give them a story that can be misread." Andrew nodded, though Harper could not see him. He typed a short reply to her, careful not to make promises she did not want. "I am here. I will not let them make your win into a charity case. You earned that trophy." She sent back a single emoji, a small relief in the immensity of the morning, the raised fist. The problem was not the truth. The problem was the appetite for narrative, and the way a public with eyes hungry for a feast could braid simple facts into a scandal. By mid-morning, his inbox was a mosaic of panic. The board wanted a conference call. A financial journalist requested comment with a deadline that made patience absurd. A community organizer who
had once protested an acquisition at one of his properties appeared on a local radio segment with an opinion that the rich always sought to redistribute their guilt as benevolence. A reporter from the features desk wanted to do a piece on philanthropic influence using his name as a case study. David marshaled allies. Thomas Green, unsurprisingly, was already on the phone. He did not mince words to the press. "Harper won because her food was the only thing in the room that made my mother cry," he told any journalist within reach. "If anyone claims otherwise, ask them to taste what she cooked. Let the palate be the arbiter." Thomas's intervention was a small, clarifying light. It reminded the conversation that taste, sensory, immediate, could be an anchor for argument. But anchors are not always heavy enough to hold a narrative when the wind turns quick and sharp. At the bistro, patrons scanned their feeds between coffees. Conversations folded into the larger rumor, people offering takes that were often less about what had happened and more about what roles such an image granted them, a chance to sit on the high end of a moral judgment. The food photographer who had taken Harper's picture sent Andrew a message. "I didn't stage anything. She belonged in that light." But photographs are evidence only in the eyes of those who want to believe what they picture. For others, they are invitations to suspicion. And then a second image surfaced, less flattering not because it showed wrongdoing, but because it offered proximity. It was a storyteller's dream, a candid shot of Andrew and a contest judge speaking near the drinks table the day before the contest, a situation explainable by politeness, but one that made for appealing headlines. The blogger connected dots with callous enthusiasm. Each connection hummed like static that could be amplified into something louder. The board's conference call was clinical and brief. "This could be a reputational risk," the general counsel said. "We should consider a statement and monitor the social channels." The risk managers spoke in the modulo of threats and mitigations.
A director who had never met Harper but loved the idea of a tidy moral line proposed that Andrew recuse himself from any public statements until an internal review could be completed. Andrew listened to the counsel and felt something harden in him, the way the city's riverbank hardened after prolonged rain. He had always been conversant in the language of mitigation. He had spent years learning how to deflect risk into spreadsheets and contingency plans. Today, the spreadsheet felt irrelevant next to the image of Harper holding a trophy and laughing as if the world had finally made a shape recognizably hers. "I will make a statement," he said. His voice on the call was quiet and then suddenly unyielding. "I will say I attended the contest. I will say I did not communicate with the judges. I did not influence the judging, and Harper's victory stands on its merits. I will not hide my attendance. I will not let her win be reduced to a charitable anecdote." The silence that followed was not the blankness of assent. It was the raised eyebrow of consequence. One of the directors, someone who had made his career on risk aversion, exhaled. "That's a headline that could cost you," she said. "It could be framed as proof of proximity. There will be calls for an independent review. Legal will want to handle the language." Andrew's answer was not reasoned, it was moral. "Then let them have a review. Let the truth be examined. But I will not let her victory be made into a story about my wallet." He hung up and began drafting a short statement in which he made plain his presence and repudiated any claim that the prize had been purchased. He tried, as best he could, to avoid making his wealth into a spectacle. He wanted the story to remain Harper's. He sent the statement to David, who advised edits that shored up legal posture while keeping the moral center. He then sent it to the features journalist who had called that morning. The journalist published it with Thomas's endorsement and an interview with Harper in which she emphasized the work, the long nights, and the way she had practiced patience with her recipes like a kind of faith. For a moment, the narrative shifted back toward the kitchen and the texture of Harper's cooking. A food critic wrote a piece about the honesty of her flavors. Neighbors from the block where she had grown up posted memories of a girl who used to sell lemon tarts after school. Thomas's voice, blunt and unfairly charming, cut through much of the noise. "If you can't appreciate the food, then you have missed the point entirely." But the relief was partial. There were still currents under that clamor. Somewhere, an anonymous tipster produced a ledger fragment suggesting that a donation had been made to a non-profit connected to the contest. It was thin, ambiguous, and unconfirmed, but it fed the worst appetites. A pundit wrote an op-ed that framed the incident as emblematic of the optics of charity. The term optics itself seemed designed to sully affection. Harper read these pieces with an expression that made Andrew afraid to look at her. The dignity she had carried into the competition felt to her like a fragile object that could be polished or smudged at the whim of others. When he saw her in the kitchen later, back at the bistro for a brief surgical shift, she moved with a quiet steadiness. Her hands were sure, even as eyes measured her. "We can get permits pulled," she said quietly, without looking up from the vegetable she was slicing. She did not ask for help. She enumerated possibilities like fingers on a ledger. If someone protests the truck's vendor permit, if the contest's partners call for an audit, if Thomas gets pressure, they can scrub any paper trail. They find. Andrew thought of the duffel, of her cooler, of the bus she had taken. None of those he could replace without making the replacement part of a spectacle. He could write checks, he could lobby, he could build policy. But checks do not always fix the wound of being seen as a thing purchased. "I'll talk to the city," he said. "I'll check the permits. I'll make sure nothing is done that jeopardizes your truck." She glanced up then, as if surprised at the gentleness of his promise. "Don't save me with headlines," she said. "Save me from permits." He agreed without ceremony. Practicalities are sometimes the truest forms of tenderness. There were practical obstacles to navigate immediately. A small cluster of lawyers on the city's vendor licensing board asked to review the paperwork for a food truck application that had not yet been filed. Someone, somewhere, had put a call into them asking for oversight. An inspector scheduled a preliminary review that could have been routine if not for the scrutiny of social media. Andrew used his influence at the administrative level not to bribe or to push the permit through, but to ensure that the review would be fair and not preemptively punitive. He made calls to remind officials of the basics, that permits are granted on the basis of code and safety, not on gossip. Meanwhile, the contest's organizers were defensive. They released a statement that reaffirmed the integrity of the judging process and invited any party with concerns to request a formal review. The phrasing was sanitized to the point of being almost useless. It was the language of organizations that did not want to be noticed. But Thomas and other chefs who had been judges sent private messages, blunt and supportive. They spoke of Harper's command of heat and balance, of the way she coaxed a sauce into a place where it remembered the idea of home. Their messages were not meant for public consumption. They were meant to fortify. Still, there was the other friction, the sense in some quarters that an immaculate story of an underdog triumph had been smudged by wealth. That smudge attracted people who make careers out of smudges. It is always easier to belittle triumph by describing it as purchased than to learn from its substance. At dusk, the blogger who had first stitched Andrew's name into the photograph uploaded a follow-up. This time, it did not merely connect cuff to rooftop, it suggested that the photograph itself had been deliberately taken to place Andrew in the frame in such a way that he could be used later as a PR prop. The accusation felt conspiratorial, as if life were a film being cut by invisible hands. The piece threaded in comments alleging a staged encounter. In the face of that momentum, facts are slow and feel weak. Andrew felt the old world, where reputation was a currency measured in invitations, crack into shards. He had tried all his life to be responsible with his wealth. He had believed that there was dignity in supporting the unseen. Now an unseen kind of storytelling suggested his money always came with strings. For the first time in a long time, he wondered if he had miscalculated what discretion could protect. He called Harper that night not to strategize, but to listen. She was irritable, raw with the day's friction, but she spoke plainly about the truck's permits and the meetings she would have to keep and the way random people felt permitted to offer moral instruction. "They don't know what it takes," she said. "They see a photo and become the judges. They don't know the recipe that sits in the back of my head when I wake up at 2 in the morning." "I know," he said. He did not offer the grand gestures of apology that his advisors sometimes suggested. No press conferences, no theatrical renunciations. He promised only what he could keep: to attend to the permit, to keep the conversation anchored to the food, to stand when truth needed a witness. In the weeks that followed, the storm moved in waves. There were op-eds, petitions to investigate, and also columns that praised the way a community had rallied around a chef whose flavors trembled with honesty. There were listeners who called the radio show to say that watching Harper had reminded them of their mother's kitchens. There were donors who offered money for the truck, but did so in ways that felt complicated and invasive. Andrew kept his presence measured. He stopped stepping into the spotlight and instead did work that would show up in quieter, long-term forms. He found himself negotiating with a merchant to hold a space near the farmer's market where the truck could apply for a regular slot. He brought, quietly, a set of contacts to help Harper with an accountant who understood the pragmatic toll of running a food business. He pushed not for publicity but for infrastructure. Harper, for her part, moved through the storm as if it were a set of pans that would need washing. She learned to answer reporters with a description of the dish, why she had used citrus at that stage, what the butter had done to the texture, and to say little about money. She let her food do the explaining. When someone asked if she was being bought, she said simply, "No, I was practicing." The photograph remained, however, a hinge in the narrative. It traveled to print and to pixel, to magazine spreads, and to the sidebar of cable news. People retraced their impressions from it the way some retrace a dream's single, unforgettable image. Andrew watched as interpretations multiplied, each one a reflection of the interpreter more than of the subject. There was, in the end, a small resolution that felt less like a climax and more like a settling. The city's vendor board completed its review and, after an administrative check, approved the permit.
Contest organizers released the notes from the judging. They were technical, repetitive, and ordinary, and yet they were precisely what Harper needed, a record that explained, in the language of food, why she had been elevated. Thomas Green, without fanfare, wrote a column about talent and fairness, not to defend Andrew, but to insist that the palate must not be mocked. When the truck finally opened, it was a thin, bright ribbon of metal parked where the farmers market had arranged spaces for vendors. Migratory light fell across its aluminum skin. Harper stood at the window, the cooler humming behind her like a small engine of life, and served a line that began as strangers and inched towards something like community. People came first for curiosity, then for a taste, then for the habit of sitting down with a dish that remembered them. Andrew watched that afternoon from one of the benches. He did not stand on the truck's steps. He did not take pictures or announce himself. He was a man who had, for once, chosen the side of smallness to protect the small work of someone else. He watched Harper move, her hands sure, her face concentrated, her laughter reserved for a small world of customers who had become, slowly, friends. At one point she looked up and met his eyes. She gave him a quick nod, an economy of thanks that asked for no trophies. He returned it with a look that admitted both relief and unease. Relief that the truck had not been prevented. Unease that there would always be a photograph ready to say otherwise. The photograph had not been able to buy her victory, but it had forced them all, Andrew, Harper, the city, the judges, the bloggers, to reckon with the shape of dignity when money collides with merit. The reckoning would not end with the truck's opening. It had only reoriented the terrain where such collisions happened. That evening, when the market wound down and the truck's lights blinked like sodium stars, Harper closed the window and turned to him. "You did good," she said, and for once the gratitude felt uncomplicated. Andrew had no extravagant reply. He had learned that words, after a certain point, either burn or cool. He chose the latter. "You cooked your way in," he said. "I only kept the gate from swinging shut on you." She laughed then, the sound more private than the morning's public mirth. "Just don't try to write the story for me," she said. "I won't," he promised. They stood in the glow of the truck's little lanterns and watched as people linger over bowls. The photo would survive in the archives of rumor. It would be reanimated in other contexts and made to say different things. But tonight, as the market emptied and the smell of browned butter vanished into the night, there was a small tenderness that no headline could entirely capture. A woman who had carved a place for herself, and a man who had decided, belatedly, imperfectly, to make himself smaller to keep that place proper. The city, as it always does, rotated on. New scandals would find their angles, new photographs would be taken and annotated. But in the narrow, stubborn geometry of the truck's light, there was a quiet victory that belonged to the work and to the patience of the people who had made it possible. Spring came on the heels of the permit, thin and patient. The truck moved with the weather, a little fuller in the afternoons, leaner in the rain. Harper learned the rhythm of customers who timed their visits around school runs and shift endings. She learned which bowls a late-night custodian favored and which weekday lunches were shared between two women who met there to plan the care of an elderly neighbor. She wrote a short menu that never claimed more than it could deliver. She kept one shelf for ingredients she refused to cheapen and one drawer for the small, necessary gambles. An herb she bought because it smelled like a place she had once been with her mother, a spice that blurred memory into food. Andrew kept going, but differently. He declined invitations that promised spectacle and accepted ones that asked only for presence. A committee meeting to rework the farmer's charter, a quiet talk with a young vendor whose permit had been mishandled, a slow dinner at a friend's apartment where the conversation stuck to small truths. He learned the value of leaving other people's work to the people who did it. His photographs still circulated. They found new subjects and new controversies. He no longer believed that a single frame could fully name a life. Once, when the truck was closing, Harper reached under the counter and brought out a small photograph in a faded frame, one that showed a street corner the way she remembered it, without glare or caption. She set it by the register. It was not the photograph that had made trouble. It was simply a reminder, for her and for anyone who asked, that the work belonged to the hands that did it. They kept to their separate modesty. When they crossed paths, they exchanged the brief, exacting gratitude that had beginning and end, a nod, a cup passed, a silence that held the shape of respect. Outside, the city continued to name and rename its scandals. Inside the truck, bowls were filled and handed over. Patrons lingered, not to be seen, but to be fed. In the slow accounting of life, that was more than enough. The photograph survived in print, in feeds, in a dozen debates. It remained, as photographs do, a thing people used to prove what they already thought. But beneath it, the growing ledger, not of pixels, but of shared meals, of apprentices taught, of small reputations rebuilt, there was a quieter archive. The list of days when someone chose to make room and someone else chose again and again to keep working. What lasted, in the end, was less an image than the slow practice of care.